The theme today, you probably know what it is. It's whether literature should be political. Atiq is going to read a text, but perhaps I should start with an introduction. This is a very vast subject, but I think there is a more specific question about the political commitment of the writer. What is the political commitment of the writer? Is it in his writing itself, or is it in the fame that the writer acquires? Is the fact that they become famous, does that give them a responsibility to be committed politically? In The Lion and the Pearl, there isn't anything political in the actual writing, but the writer is committed politically. So should writers be politically engaged, either in their writing or in what they do as writers? And you do wonder with some writers who write things that are so disconnected with what's going on in their country, you do wonder whether they were really aware of what was going on in their country. So is the commitment of a writer, does it come through what he believes art to be? Should he be giving a universal stance to his writing? Before I start, I'd like to admit something. I'm a bad person. I was bad already when I was at school, because I was always late in my homework, and I always handed it in late. I was already bad in my family. I was a bad boy. When I went into law, I was a bad boy as well. I studied literature. I'm a bad boy also with my publisher. And I am today, because I gave Michel Lebris to Michel Lebris, and today the text I'm going to read is very different. Why? Because I have a problem with the word duty. I don't speak very good French, and so duty, devoir in French, I wrote it in 2 words. So let's see what this is going to turn out to be. And before starting with theoretical ideas, I'd like to take you to Kabul, my native city, in the 80s. The country was in the throes of the Soviets. I was young and politically committed, much more so than today. I was in a very political family. My father was for the monarchy, my mother for mysticism, my sister was a feminist. What about me then? I had no other choice but to be an anarchist. So, a bad boy, once and again. At the time, I was a student, and I wrote critics. I was detached from anything religious. I was disappointed by any political ideology. And so I hid behind literature. But in a literature that I called at the time the literature of despair. Samuel Beckett was my model. And I wrote a text as a manifesto. 2 days later, I was told to meet the head of university, and I met with a Soviet. For him, despair, absurdity, melancholy, nostalgia, silence were just capitalist concepts. So I was reduced to silence. I took my words with me and I went into exile. I arrived in Pakistan in '84. I joined the Afghan resistance and we were threatened by the Mujahids because I was the brother of a communist. At the time, the US had given Saudis the responsibility of dealing with the Afghan resistance. And human beings as individuals have no values in that context. Nobody cares about what we are and what we do. We're only judged as regards our families and so on. So I asked to go into exile in France, and a few months later I arrived in France. I always said, I never said I was a political refugee, but that I was a cultural refugee. After my studies, I did a few ads. I did anything that didn't have anything to do with politics, and that's what I did until my brother was killed. I then wrote Térésandre because I couldn't deal with the death of my brother. I wrote it in Persian, my mother tongue. It was translated in French, and it was published in '99. At the time, Afghanistan was just a memory in the world's eyes. And my book opened up this reality to the eyes of people, and that was until 9/11. Then my book was published again, came out again, and everyone wanted to buy it. And in the Nouvel Observateur, a French magazine, there was an article which said that in 1 week, 10,000 copies of the Quran were sold. And my book sold 11,000 copies, so more than the Quran, in a week. Everywhere in the media, whenever they wanted an Afghan stance on what was going on in politics, they asked me. So I became a sociologist, and I was always given my opinion. So as an Afghan writer, I wasn't committed in history. I was embarked, as Camus said, taking Pascal's words. Yes, you are embarked, whether you like it or not. As far as I was aware, it wasn't creation, but it was reception that was political. Why was there such a need to read my book? It was just a small book, talking about coming to terms with death. Why make it political? How was my book ever going to change anything in the world? could it change anything in Afghanistan? And if I ask this question, it's because politics is about acting to maintain the order. So what does literature do, and how does it do it? Let's ask ourselves then, as though it were for the first time. Let's forget for a moment that before us, and since the 18th century, writers have asked themselves the same question time and time again, at the risk of losing themselves in it, or of happily finding an answer. Let's ask ourselves then, because, as Maurice Blanchot would put it, questions are the desire of thoughts. And he adds, but answers are their sorrow. So, as to avoid making this question, which has marked the history of literature, a sorrowful one, I'd like to start with a tale. This is part of my original culture. In Persian culture, philosophers, politicians start telling stories. So Maurice Blanchot wouldn't be full of sorrow if he were Afghani. So in the major book of Persian literature called Memorial of the Saints, which was written in the 13th century, the great poet Farid ud-Din Attar explains that one day a young disciple asked his master what the power of wise men was. Speech, the master said. Speech. Then the master showed his disciple the mountain at the foot of which he lived as a hermit and said, when a wise man orders his mountain to move, it moves. And at that precise moment, the mountain started shaking. The master scolded. I've not asked you to move. I just wanted to show him an example. On the surface, of course, this tale shows what has been mankind's dream since time immemorial. To create, to change, to move, to destroy, to rebuild the world with words. Just with words. Who hasn't dreamt of being able to say one day, let there be light, and to see light appear? Any man is God when he dreams, said Hölderlin. Yet, beyond this mystical and fanciful quest, there is something in this tale which makes me wonder about the link between the power of speech of wise men, intellectuals, and writers. First, about asking a mountain to move and getting it to move. I interpret this allegorically and perhaps naively, as a pragmatic aspect of language. Its transitive function. And I don't just mean in our daily conversations, but also in a literary text. Then, about the fact that the wise man just gives an example, and that the example becomes a commandment, that opens a debate on the notion of exemplarity in literature. That's when I went to my books. Because as I said, there are so many questions that I need to turn to the wise men. But with comments. So here's where I go back to what I studied at university. Everyone undoubtedly remembers the following title, which is magical in French, Quand dire, c'est faire, and which is ironic in English, How to Do Things with Words. That was written by John Langshaw Austin. I'm going to bore you just very quickly with this. When speaking of performative utterance, this philosopher means a series of sentences which aren't simply a string of words that explain a state or a situation. They become the very act they describe. Once uttered, they can change a life dramatically, or a community's life. For instance, I pronounce you man and wife, used by a mayor, or war is declared, used by a statesman, who just by uttering these words throws his people in the great madness and terror it involves. A few centuries ago, in Amsterdam's synagogue, a sermon banished Spinoza from the Jewish community and condemned him to silence. And more recently, a fatwa forced Salman Rushdie into concealment. Believers say that even the universe is created by the very words of God. And even if we don't believe it, we still witness the way the words attributed to God lead men to action, whether on the path of wisdom or the madness of suicide attacks. But you might ask, is this the doing of the power of words or of the words of power? Going back to John Austin, he said it well, for a performative utterance to be fortunate, as he put it himself, in other words, feasible, you need the right set of circumstances. You can't just have anyone pronounce any couple man and wife. First and foremost, the person who unites the two beings must have some legitimacy and some power. Then the couple must fulfill certain conditions, and so on. And to get a mountain to move, you have to gain some wisdom first. In order to cry, I accuse, you have to be Zola first. And to be Zola, you have to have written Nana, Germinal, The Beast Within, and so on. And in order to write this, you had to have read many. It is splendid to be a great writer, said Flaubert, to put men into the frying pan of your words and make them pop like chestnuts. There must be a delirious pride in the feeling that you are bringing the full weight of your ideas to bear on mankind. But for that, you must have something to say. When the writer has something to say, does it follow that he changes anything in the world? Sartre would say yes, because for him, saying things means wanting to change them. Talking or writing means acting on the world. Bright minds will probably ask, if writers wield such power with their speech, why is the world torn in 1,000 pieces? Why is there so much tyranny, so much war, so much injustice? Where do we find ourselves after Germinal, after War and Peace, after a farewell to arms, after the plague. What is literature up to? Alas, another question that sentences literature to uncertainty. Clearly, if Marx had followed his dreams of youth and written the most beautiful novel in the world, he would have held the world spellbound, but he wouldn't have moved it. You therefore have to write Capital and not War and Peace. You don't describe Caesar's murder, you have to be Brutus. Making such links, such comparisons, might seem absurd to onlookers. But when art is weighed against action, immediate and pressing, then action can only consider art as wrong, and art can only concur. Maurice Blanchot said these words, and he's not wrong. Even Sartre, a keen supporter of politically active literature, said in a fit of despair, when a child is dying, nausea seems very lightweight. Or Hölderlin, what are poets good for in times of trouble? But before sinking into unfathomable despair, let's reassure this poet. You're here precisely to tell us what poets are good for in times of trouble.
J'ai pas le pouvoir de dire descendez.
I don't have the power to tell them what to do. So, what are poets good for in times of trouble? But before sinking into unfathomable despair, let's reassure poets. You're here precisely to tell us what poets are good for in times of trouble. Because by telling us that, poets name, define, and recall the nature of our lives in these times of trouble. Just as Sham, master of Rumi, a mystic Persian in the 13th century. I'll read it out in Persian first.
ما را اهلیت گفت نیست کاش که اهلیت شنودن بوده تمام گفتن می باید و تمام شنودن اما بر گوش ها مهر است بر زبان ها مهر است بر دل ها مهر است nous ne sommes pas aptes.
We're not able to talk. If only we could listen. We must say all and listen to all. But our ears are sealed, our lips are sealed, our hearts are sealed. This cry has echoed for centuries to denounce the permanent and implacable censorship that is breathed into the heart of writers. In Iran, just as well as Afghanistan, my country of origin, or elsewhere, where words defy tyranny. In those countries, the existential problem isn't to be or not to be, but to say or not to say. That is the question. Thus, any act becomes political, even silence, even lies. That's good. I remember that when Soviets were in Afghanistan, a brilliant saying from Poland was used by intellectuals. And it went, if you want to survive, don't think. If you think, don't talk. If you talk, don't write. If you write, don't sign it. If you sign it, don't be surprised. Unfortunately, this still goes for my native country. Even if the post-Taliban constitution allows freedom of the press. But the problem lies elsewhere. It lies in each of us, because our hearts are sealed. In the south of Afghanistan, Pashtun women have a poetic tradition called Lande. These are short, anonymous poems which reveal a lot on their condition, their desires, their dreams. Like, for instance, lay your lips on mine, but leave my tongue free, that I may tell you I love you. Imagine what would happen to that woman, this anonymous and illiterate woman, if she signed this. So even love, even desire can become political. This is how, by describing the conditions of mankind or by revealing humanity's desires and dreams, a literary text can above all become a cry, an act of proclamation. It gives a syntax to the cry, as Deleuze would put it. It is a performative utterance, and even if that cry doesn't waken slumbering spirits, as in my country, at least it might trouble their sleep. Such an act isn't a provocation, but a provocation. In that sense, politics isn't the will, the fear, or the duty of the writer. It is in the ink of its writing. Now, let's talk about the other aspect of the literary experience, its exemplarity. I'm almost done. We live. Man's world is the planet of inexperience, said Kundera. Inexperience is a quality of the human condition. We're born one time only. We never start a new life equipped with the experience we've gained from a previous one. It is because this world is a planet of inexperience that literature has a meaning. Given that we don't live a permanent experience, literature helps us conceive the life of others, of those who've lived before our time, or those who live at the same time as we do, but elsewhere, as a pointer, perhaps as a mimetic desire. We live, and so we think with and through other people's experiences, just as others live with and through our writing, as an existential, sentimental, political, metaphysical experience. Salman Rushdie said, "It is literature which for me opened the mysterious and decisive doors of imagination and understanding, to see the way others see, to think the way others think, and above all, to feel." Before him, Diderot said, "Reading novels makes us better people, not only because fictions illustrate abstract principles or because characters show us what behaviors to adopt or avoid, but also because it turns the empathy felt by the reader into an experience of the other, therefore an altruist experience." In that sense, an experience isn't just personal experience. It isn't just past. It isn't a study, a scientific experiment carried out to check or justify knowledge data, which would make it a future-oriented act. It is the proof of our existence, here and now. It is the act of meditating on what we live. It is living the world as the world lives us. It is an inner experience for Georges Bataille and an original experience for Maurice Blanchot. It is being in touch with oneself. It is renewing the self through that contact. It means to rebuild it as I wish, by changing the world bit by bit. One day we will change the world. So should we still doubt the political dimension of literature? First, I'd say yes. We must doubt it. Because, as Paul Valéry says, politics means wanting to conquer and to retain power. It therefore involves an action of constraint or of illusion over minds, which are the essence of all power. The political mind always ends up forced into forgery. It introduces a forged intellectual currency onto the market. It introduces forged historical notions. It builds specious reasoning arguments. In a word, it does anything it can to keep its authority, its so-called moral authority. And then I'd say no, because literature is a fight against all political systems. It is the power of words against the words of power. And today, more than ever before, we need literature, because all ideologies have failed to change the world. Only literature does. Thus, the definition of politics in writing. Thank you.
I think after this beautiful text, there are no comments to be made. But we will give the floor to the audience. I do have one request. Whoever takes the floor must stand and introduce themselves. So, any person wishing to speak should stand. I'm not saying must stand, but should stand. It's so they can be filmed and seen by everybody. Thank you.
Debout. Donc, alors, ça fonctionne? Non?
Yeah, just tap on the mic.
Stendhal said that politics and literature is like a gunshot in the middle of a concert. My name is Dimitris Stefanakis. I'm a Greek writer.
Je suis romancier. Et je pense que en ce qui concerne la dimension politique de la
I'm a novelist, and I think in terms of the political dimension of literature, I believe that literature is a political act because it attempts to answer the major issues of social life. On the other hand, I believe that we
cette dimension politique de la littérature.
should be careful when it comes to the political dimension of literature. Let's take the example of George Orwell in George Orwell, sorry, in 1984.
Presque détruit son œuvre en essayant
His work was quasi-destroyed when
sa pensée politique.
there was an attempt to extract his political thinking.
La pensée politique doit être
In literature,
allusive.
political thought should be elusive in order for it to work well. For instance, I think Shakespeare's plays are just as political as Orwell's work is. Anna Karenina is a political text which denounces family injustice and the social position of women. But unlike Orwell,
Tolstoy cherche à mettre en relief
Tolstoy
son côté littéraire.
wants to bring out its literary side. And I would like to add something to what you've just read to us.
Il y a en
There was, in the early part of the century, there was a rather naive theory
qu'on peut changer le monde par le biais de la
whereby
littérature.
it's possible to
Je
change the
pense
world through
qu'aujourd'hui,
literature.
on a décidé que c'est un mensonge.
I think that today it has been decided that this was a lie.
Le monde
You
par
cannot
le biais de la
change, you cannot
littérature.
improve the world through literature.
On ne peut pas aussi distinguer le mal du bien.
Nor can we make a distinction between good and evil.
Moi, je pense que pour le moment, il faut continuer à écrire.
I think that
Il
now,
faut juste continuer
in the present day, we need to
exprimer
continue to write,
notre aspect
to
personnel.
continue
C'est
to
tout
express
qu'on peut faire.
what is personal to us.
Sinon,
I think
on
that's
risque
all that we
de
can do.
supprimer la
Otherwise,
littérature
there's a
elle-même.
risk of
On dit
simply
qu'il y a toujours un
doing
côté
away with literature.
politique,
We say that there's always a political
un côté politique
aspect,
chez les
political
Et si on
dimension
essaie de supprimer
in
ces
writers.
côtés, on risque de
And if we
supprimer
try
la
and
conscience narrative.
do away with it, we're going to be doing away, we're going to be
Il faut
throwing out
toujours
narrative
donner,
consciousness.
la priorité
But we must
au
always
côté littéraire.
put
Parce que
first
on
the literary
dit jamais qu'on,
dimension.
connaît deux hommes, deux femmes littéraires. Merci.
Je crois que j'ai pas dit le contraire.
I don't think I said the opposite of what you've said. But then, as to the question of whether or not literature can change the world, it's an extremely broad question. I said that with literature one changes worlds, but you don't change the world. If indeed we are here today having this discussion, having this exchange with all these persons, and that this is where freedom is rooted. This is a fight against obscurantism. This didn't just come about so easily. Literature doesn't only have an immediate role on or impact on humans. This is something that transpires over centuries. Just imagine what would be humanity with Mahabharata? What would be humankind without the Odyssey and the Iliad? What would be humankind without these great books and major texts? It gave us consciousness, and it's consciousness that has brought us to this point. So it's not an immediate action or impact of literature. It's something that has occurred over centuries. And that is the way it is, and fortunately so. We're saying the same thing, but we're saying it with different words. So, in your opinion, it's the same thing that is happening through literature, but the very idea of freedom, justice, equality are not goals to be achieved, and these are not the attributes of an ideal world. No, I was saying that by denouncing human conditions, literature opens our eyes and makes us see our human condition, and that's where we develop our consciousness or awareness. In any event, I really think that we're saying the same thing, but simply using different words. I would like to add something. I agree with what you're both saying. And there's a telephone that's also chiming in to tell us that we are right. I think we make a mistake whether we are writers or not. And that is when we believe that literature should have a goal or an outcome, and this may be quantified. But when one speaks of literature, if we return to the idea that we're always coming back to the fundamentals of the human condition, there is something that has been accomplished, and I think it's universal when we read the major texts of literature. It has never made it possible to go to another society, to change society. It has brought us back to our major concerns. All the great texts of literature are tragic. They're not hopeful. If you read Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, or any great writer of any culture, it brings us back to our human condition. And if we had had any hopes, we probably would lose them in reading the major texts of literature. None of these major texts really bring hope. They're all tragic because they also bring us back to death. And literature carries this beauty that's almost useless in the moment, and they are, of course, the pride of nations after having first ignored them. Let us not forget that when Thomas Mann or Stefan Zweig were writing their beautiful texts, we also had Hitler. So they had no other choice but to go into exile. And if that weren't enough, as in Stefan Zweig's case, not only did he take exile, but he committed suicide. But that's part of the heritage that Germany is proud of. So it becomes part of the ideology that nations use in their relationships with others. And sometimes even writers are used in order to reaffirm the superiority of one nation over another. In France, for instance, we have leading writers who say we can hear about such and such a writer, but they haven't had choice. We have choice, so we're better. We have to make a distinction between the political dimension of literature per se and the ability of literature to actually influence the political destiny of nations. In this regard, literature will play no role.
Bonjour. Thank you very much. My name is Gobana, I'm a South African writer, and I just wanted to add something very small, that I think we should be cautious not to put any limits on literature. I think the word should does not have a place in literature. I think putting limits on what people should or should not write destroys literature. I think writing is risky, putting your ideas on paper is risky, but all things in life that are worth doing are risky, and I think we are better for it.
Bonjour, moi je suis simplement venue écouter.
I came to listen, and I would like to return to the question, the topic of this discussion: should literature be political? And I would like to return to what you alluded to. That is to say, the duty of literature, as if literature had a duty, a responsibility, or a mission, and you start out by saying that you were a bad boy because you hated this word, duty. So, the question is, does literature have a duty? Does it have a mission? Undeniably, literature is not just novels, it's also essays, poetry, songs in all countries of the world. And literature is made of words that have a power. Power that fights against the words that are used by the power in place. So it does have a mission to bring about a change in the mindsets of the readers, to help us to move forward, to help us to think differently. But it is also dangerous. Unfortunately, yes, it's dangerous because it makes us think, fortunately, in a different way. And in my view, this era is characterized by the fact that we get too many ready-made ideas. We're really conditioned. And fortunately, that literature does have this mission to help us, to bring us to a point where we can think differently. So I'd like for us to come back to the political role of literature. When we hear singers, bards, I'm thinking, for instance, of Garcia Lorca, who sang and denounced a dictatorship in his country, and his fingers were cut off. So I believe that when men speak out, when they choose to speak out, and they use it not only because they want to speak out, because they're actually able to do so. Are they actually given the freedom to speak out? So is literature a space where you can be free to think and to move the world forward?
Merci pour votre contribution.
Thank you for that contribution. My name is Bernard Chambaz. I'm a French writer. Lorca was shot in a ravine in Visnar next to Grenada. He was shot along with an anarchist school teacher who was lame, who had been wounded, and who was carried with crutches. And the Frankist militia that killed him, before killing him, had fun with him, kicking out his crutches to make him crawl. And this school teacher and Lorca died together, shot. In an absolutely base, because Lorca, because he was homosexual, was allowed the coup de grace shot in the head, but also shot in the ass. So it was absolutely vile and base. I agree with our Greek friend who says that we probably all say the same thing, but in ways that might be slightly different. I did want to say something about hope, and maybe we're talking here about whether the glass is half full or half empty, and I completely agree with you with what you say about despair. But I also believe that literature does carry hope. And I'd like to give you as an example the book by Elio Vittorini, Conversations in Sicily. He starts with this famous sentence on the abstract Führer. And this book was written in 1938 under Mussolini. And the book, of course, is tragic, and it's full of despair. And yet, every time that you read it, because of his writing, because of its poetic content, and it is an absolutely superb book, and it gives us back hope in humanity when it puts before us the very tragedy of humanity. And then there's another example I'd like to give that goes maybe slightly beyond the confines of what Tariq said in his fascinating comments. Beyond the issue of duty, when we talk about politics, of course, we talk about freedom of expression. That goes without saying. But in politics, of course, there's a deeply social dimension. And I won't say societal is something I really don't like as a term, because I think it tends to just introduce confusion. So as I was saying, I'd like to give you the other example of Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Of course, we've all read it. But I'm very struck by one thing in Hugo's Misérables. He sold somewhat less than Tariq in 1 week's time, but at the time, it was selling very, very well. And what was really astonishing is that workers stopped for their lunch break and they were reading Les Misérables. They would read a chapter during their lunch break. And they loved the book because it gave them some sense of dignity. And in the end, when they finished the book, the workers would basically decide among themselves that they basically drew straws to see who would get to keep the book. So in the stories, Les Misérables, anecdote, there is a political side to it. I mean, it is an expression of how literature can be political.
Merci.
Thank you. I'm very interested in this debate because I'm Bartio Matuali. I work on the question of sociolinguistics on Haiti. I'm glad you mentioned Austin, who works about when to say is to do. When we talk about whether literature can change things, people think about immediate changes, but actually these changes take place over the course of years. Just think about Madame de Sailly said, literature is an art before it is a weapon. But I cannot forget the book called Gouverneur de la Rosée, which shows what Haitian society is about. And when you read this book, you realize that you could change things. Of course, these changes aren't immediate, but they happen through time. And through the teachings of literature, questioning what kind of literature do you want to teach in order to show change. As for politics, with regards to literature, should literature be politically active? You can wonder whether in today's world can you live without politics? Can you live without putting together political structures within literature? Now, I'm thinking about a Haitian actor who's political, socially committed and active, because that is how you meet the needs of society. I do research. Am I doing research for the sake of research? No, it has to be useful research that is going to contribute to the country's needs. And writers have that same role to play in social structures. So writing has a role. It has to help people to breathe so that they can go beyond and above daily lives. So, for me, literature is part of the changes that happen in society, so it has to be political. Thank you.
My name is Wem Akpan. I'm a Nigerian writer. Thank you for your presentation in a very nice paper. Today, Nigeria is mourning the death of Chinua Achebe, our big African writer who wrote Things Fall Apart. That book changed things. It changed, in many ways, the way the Western world was looking at Africa. The change still needs to continue. But it changed something. That book is being taught in many universities around the world. And maybe the Europeans begin to see that Africans have culture, that Africans are people, unlike what Immanuel Kant and Engels, said about Africa. So for me, literature can also do that. It can open the mind. It can open the mind. Should a writer be political? Should he go to the streets and mount a protest? I'm not sure. It depends on the temperament of the writer. Can he do it well? In our country, Wole Soyinka does that very well. He combines poetry, fiction, documentary, essays, political involvement. He's founded a political party. God blessed him with the powers and energies he needs to, so he's able to do that. Should everybody do it? I don't think everybody has these gifts. Okay. Now, I think also literature should not be propaganda. Once it becomes propaganda, there's a problem. I shouldn't be writing literature, since I'm a Catholic priest, to tell people, come and join the Catholic Church. If you're not a Catholic, you're doomed. No. Literature should not be doing that. Literature should create that space in the mind and help to open the mind to other possibilities, to allow other people to be. This is what I think, might be the place of literature, even in today's world. And one thing that always strikes me about the life of Jesus Christ is, at the beginning, he did not say, come and baptize people, take this religion to Afghanistan. He said to the first disciples, come and see. Come and see. That was it. When you have seen, when you have felt the beautiful poetry, the beautiful words, the imagery, some semblance of order in the work and challenge and vision, then you can go and try to unsee if you can. You can go to sleep if you want, but the freedom should be there. So this is what I think literature, should do. It should never be propaganda. Once it becomes propaganda, there is a problem. It should not be used to destroy the little man. Once that happens, and the little man suffers because of literature. Unfortunately, the great works of the world, is about openness, inclusiveness. We belong together. That's all I want to say. Thank you for your presentation.
Oui. Juste un mot justement sur la question dans le texte.
About being politically active. When, in my text, what I wanted to say was about the powers of the words of a writer. And I also talked about the writer's authority. And I'd like to give you an example that I find absolutely extraordinary. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He wrote Émile. And through that book, he changed education. He really did. Absolutely. That book really became a kind of law for the entire educational system in Switzerland, in France, and even in the United States. This is the book. Whereas he had left his wife and his children in complete and utter misery. So I really wanted to ask him, Jean-Jacques, how can you write something like that and then abandon your wife and children? And he replies, if I hadn't abandoned my children, then I'd never have written that book. I'd like to add something. There's also a problem, a recurring problem. When we think and talk about literature, very often we have a naively radical view of things, either good or evil. We forget that most people are set in a social background and they've lived through situations. Think about the German occupation. Several French authors chose to collaborate, and they might have led people to the worst. So sometimes we tend to forget that writers are also human beings. And so when they come out of the beauty of their writing, they're not necessarily perfect. When you talk about Soyinka, yes, well, beyond their own texts, perhaps many Nigerians have not read those texts. Well, these writers use their authority as human beings to fight for causes. Soyinka went to prison. He wrote about his experience of prison in That Man is Dead. But in that same country, you have Ken Saro-Wiwa also, who didn't have the opportunity of, well, I mean, while giving his authority to the people, he was hanged. There was another authority beyond Saro-Wiwa. He was a committed person, but that got him killed. So we need to distinguish between the writer and the human being. A writer becomes visible, and once he becomes visible, does he have the right to remain neutral when there are problems in his country? This is a question I wonder about. You know, when you watch TV, you get lots of news, but sometimes you get a few images. When you got your prize, I remember that as soon as you're an Afghani and you get a prize, everyone wanted you to support the cause of refugees. And so the question is, do you have the right of saying, I'm a writer, and I can choose not to care about the problem of Afghani refugees? But perhaps you're not just Atiq, Rahimi, the writer, but you're also the person who's gotten this prize and who could change the lives of those refugees. There was something when you got that prize that turned you into a voice that would be heard. And that's also part of what we call when we talk about being politically active. When you talk about Haiti, yes, of course, there are many texts that we could talk about. Jacques-Stéphane Alexis, writer, didn't just use his writing in order to speak of a problem. He decided to be socially engaged, and that got him killed. And sometimes we might have to go back to concrete examples, individual examples that aren't universal because contexts change. You have a different audience, you have to deal with the regime in your country. But if you go back to writing, I'd say there's one thing that's really always struck me, which is that art is a way of showing us what is going to remain. One example is a film that's very important for literature. It talks about a serial killer who kills children. And at these were two criminals in the Nazi era. M. Le Maudit is the name of the film. But what's important in that film is the beauty of images, the beauty of people, even the beauty of the criminals in that film. You end up even thinking, I hope he doesn't get caught, because you can see his humanity. He becomes our brother. And you end up loving this serial killer because there is a lot of humanity in that character. And being able to go beyond the nature of people through art is something incredible. But these are individual cases. You also have Zola, I Accuse, and you have Céline. These are two really great writers, but they are very different.
Oui, merci pour votre texte que j'ai vraiment.
Thank you for your text, which I thought was beautiful. Well done to the bad boy. There are many bad boys in literature. And bad boys, after all, are those who shake the established authorities. There's something you said which I like. You said it isn't a creation which is political, it's the way it's received and perceived. And I got the feeling that your text was telling us, was forcing us to face our responsibility as readers. After all, we're here, we're interested in literature, we're interested in reading. We, too, have this very important responsibility of supporting writers in their work. And I thought your text was a call so that we're all bad boys, after all, and I thought that was great. Thank you. Hi, my name's Clément Cagliari, I'm a writer. I just wanted to say something. I think it's great that we get to talk about political commitment, because I think that for years that was the main responsibility of writers, to try and get more justice. And today, a lot of literature is no longer political. It only talks about the personal life of writers without really taking a political stance. But actually, whether or not you write in a political way or not, the book itself is already inevitably political, even if you don't want to, even if you choose just to talk about your own life outside of what's going on in the world. Even by refusing to talk about politics, that's a political stance. Now, perhaps you could think about what is literature capable of doing. Well, I don't think a book is going to change the world, but it can help you think in a different way. It can give you another point of view, it might be another way of doing politics. Today we're facing one of the biggest economic crises since the 20s and 30s. And the place of writers, what is it today? Should politics always take place in parliaments, on the media, on TV? Well, perhaps not. One possibility, I think, of literature is to show that actually you can do politics in schools, at work, in the streets, anywhere where literature gets a voice, in a bus. And the fact that you can get people to talk about politics through literature is a great way of defining politics differently, politics from the grassroots in a way. And I think this is something that writers should do more. I'm thinking of Fontamarin, which is a book on poor farmers in Italy in the 20s, or Élise and La Vraie Vie, a love story between a French working girl and a guy from the Maghreb. And these books show the political context of the time, but in a different way. So perhaps we still have a long way to go. But I'd say that given the current context, I think it's a shame that writers aren't more politically active. Although, as I said, it doesn't have to be politics in terms of, waving a manifesto or anything like that. It can be much more subtle than that. But I'm just saying a literature that would enable people to be more politically involved in their daily lives. I think that's essential. And the reason why I'm saying this is that because we are always given political solutions. We're being told about austerity, about decreasing public finances. And we could show the effects of those policies, show what it might lead our world to. Literature could do that. And often, literature doesn't use that tool and that weapon to change the minds of people in everyday life.
Yes. Again, my name is Uwem Akban. I remember when I first started publishing, before I knew it, a lot of different groups in my country are saying, "Oh, speak for us, say something about us." And I remember many times, someone would come and say, "Look, I have a story. I have a story. It's a very painful story. I want you to write my story." I'm like, "No, you go and write your story. Let me be." What I want to say again is this. We writers have to be careful. It would be very good if we could write and then go out and act and engage the political process. But we have to know that we know what we are doing. If you don't understand the process, you're going to mess things up, because the world today is, this celebrity culture. The fact that someone knows how to do one thing doesn't mean he knows everything. So footballers are talking, fashion designers are talking, all kinds of, people, even people with very questionable ethics. Some of these Hollywood stars, you don't really know where they stand. Okay? So now the problem is, do you have what to say to the political process? And with all due humility, if as a writer you don't know that process very well, believe you me, you are better off, backing off. It's also part of humility. If you've done a good work, as you have said, if you've written your work well, that in itself, might be better than, going into something you don't understand. I'm not talking about something dangerous. It is okay to go and do something dangerous if you understand it and believe in it, and it will bring, succor to the rest of the people or the people concerned. I think we should go in that direction. The reason I say this is there's a lot of pressure in the developing world on writers. Everybody comes to you, you have to speak for us, you have to, and sometimes You need to sit back and say, what do I know? Do I need to do a bit more education before I say what I need, to say? Because some of us, we stand up and we say things we shouldn't say, and we're sounding like tribalists. And at the end, it doesn't help, anybody. And we begin also to sound like racists because we don't understand, again, how the world works. So I'm just throwing out, caution there. We should know what we are doing.
Bon, moi je suis juste une lectrice.
I am just a reader. And I've come here, and I've been coming here for a long time, and I was very much struck by what was said by the young writer, because during 3 days I waited impatiently for everybody to finally talk about freedom, because everywhere we talk about politics, economics, and let's face it, the crisis that we're going through are going to have disastrous consequences on the African world, on the Western world. So the crisis will have terrible consequences for everybody. It's something we're already realizing. So when we're confronting the power, we know power. The powers that be have words. I don't know where it is. I simply hear Tina, there is no alternative. And it's more urgent than ever for literature to bring us back to the fundamental freedom of being able to say with words that come from somewhere, that come from a given place, and that these words say there is still freedom. And I'd like to thank you, because the first time in 3 days that I hear this. Maybe we all need to come out of this sort of stupefied state in which we are because of the crisis. We don't even know what to say anymore because we don't know where the problem is coming from. We don't know how to go about tackling the problem. And if indeed there is an enemy, a foe, we don't know what to do. So words of freedom, and let us speak them again. And I'd like to thank this writer whom I admire, because he gave voice to a woman. And we can only be deeply moved by this text, as I am. Thank you.
Bonjour. Bonjour, je m'appelle Toby Nathan.
Hi, my name is Toby Nathan. I'd like to say hello to Atiq. Atiq,
Parole très ancienne.
the elder. Thank you for your words, your words that hark back in time. And I would like to maybe upset the apple cart.
Enfin, c'est la volonté. La volonté est un désordre.
And it's deliberate. And remind who's reading and who's writing.
Présence de Samy Atiq qui sait de quoi je parle.
And I'm saying this in the presence of people who know what I'm talking about. We have said that there are people without writing. There are peoples without writing. The question is who writes and who reads. In our countries, in Benin or in Togo, it's the gods who write. And people try to read what the gods write. So they try to write by throwing shells on the ground, or getting spiders to walk, or looking at the imprints of the fox left at nighttime, and they know what the gods are writing. Who's writing? Is it the gods? Is it man? You say, I'm a writer. Do you really think that you are writing? That's incredible. Atiq, you, the elder, you know that you're not writing. Just a reminder, there is one word. I'm absolutely amazed and speechless in the face of one word. There are many chapters in the Bible that start with Vayikra in Hebrew, which is translated by he, and God called upon Moses. And then what does Moses do? Moses doesn't know how to write, but he doesn't know how to write. Neither does Muhammad. So it's God who is writing. Vayikra in Hebrew is translated by he called, but that's not what it means. It means he read. God read. What did he read? He read the events of the world. By reading the events of the world, then Moses awoke and spoke. So it's God who read. And the text in Arabic is even worse. It's called the Quran. It's one world. It's the call. And in Arabic, we say qara. He read. He didn't read. He was called. So who is reading and who is writing? I'm sorry. I do apologize. I don't want to completely throw you into utter confusion, but today we've been able to read the writing. To read all kinds of signs. Sometimes the imprints of a flies left on a paper was something that we read as signs, but no more. The book has disappeared. All of you are going to be writers. You're all bloggers, right? Right? So you're all possessed. So this brings to mind another religious event, and remember St. Paul. And he says, no more than 3 during Mass. And we're more than 3, by the way. So no more than 3 during a Mass. Otherwise, you'll have a cacophony. And that's our world. We can no longer tell who is the God who is reading. And that's what I wanted to say.
Ça marche? Oui.
Toby Nathan, I wish we were all bloggers. I'm very modestly a blogger, but I don't see a lot of them here for the festival, so we'll exchange coordinates afterwards. I'm going to try not to repeat what was just said, and he basically cut the grass under my feet, but pulled the rug under my feet. I also don't want to upset the apple cart, but we talked before about borders, and I see many foreign authors here, and I see topics that are political in nature, engagé, and as was just said, I regret the fact that Parisian literature tends to be about navel gazing and, relationships to the parents, failed love stories, etc. And it's true that it's all about us. And I'm the first one to go out and read these things that are not necessarily very poetic. But the paradox that this brings me to is that in France, foreign writers or those who are of mixed backgrounds or of foreign background who live in France, and it doesn't really matter because in literature you can't really speak of borders, but they tend to be celebrated because of their political stance, because they wrote books with a political and social engagement, because I think that when you're an activist in the social sphere, you're also a political activist. But what we forget to say is that many of the authors, French authors, and not all of them, I don't want to generalize, but I see a lot of them, have completely overlooked this aspect of literature's meaningfulness. So once again, we tend to celebrate these foreign writers in France and say, well, it's fantastic what you're doing and your activism, your commitment. And at the same time, we are not doing that. So it's something that's very specifically French. We celebrate the others and we're trying to be very moralistic, but we're not doing it at the same time. So I'm sure that half the people here might be quite angry with me as a result.
je ne crois pas que ça soit propre de tous les écrivains français, hein, ce que vous venez de dire. Oui, quand même, hein, le fait que durant ces 3 jours que je suis là, donc j'ai rencontré tous ces écrivains, ils ont un engagement. Et d'ailleurs, n'oublions pas que j'ai jamais, quand on lit l'histoire littéraire du monde, il y a beaucoup de questionnements sur le rapport entre l'engagement et la littérature.
So there are a lot of questions about the relationship between engagement and literature.
Oui, ça, je peux vous dire ça.
So I can say that this is true in the United States. It's not specific to what's going on here.
Non, ça c'est... Non, il y a une... C'est vrai qu'il y a une... En France...
In France, it's a political interpretation of literature. But once again, because it's part of the tradition of French literature. So it's because it was French writers were always very engagés, be it Diderot or others. And when it comes to navel gazing, call it what you want to call it. It's, self-reflective, very self-referential fiction, self-absorbed. You're writing in front of the computer, you're blogging, I'm going to write, I'm going to take a stance, I'm going to change the world. But if an author does that, writer does that, he's not a writer. That's my opinion. I think that we are wounded or we are joyful, and that's what urges us on to write. Who speaks within us? That is a major question. Who is speaking? Your interpreters apologize, but we must leave because we have other engagements.
Une œuvre majeure, à la différence de Nouvelle Héloïse, qui n'a rien changé, mais reste une œuvre formidable. Et je voudrais aussi ajouter qu'à la recherche du temps perdu, n'a rien changé au monde, mais n'a rien changé, sauf notre point de vue littéraire.
Et alors, c'est ça qui est formidable.
Oui, mais n'a rien changé du côté politique.
J'ai jamais dit ça. À mon avis, tout mon texte était sur ça.
Il y a des livres qui changent le monde, mais dans la plupart des fois, ils ne sont pas majeurs du côté littéraire. Il faut distinguer le changement et la valeur littéraire.
On est d'accord, non, ça.
Émile n'est pas une œuvre majeure, une œuvre de référence. À mon avis.
Ça, c'était un exemple.
Merci.
Bon, il est l'heure 5. Merci pour votre écoute, vos contributions. C'est la fin, tout a une fin.
Tu me mets ?